My name is Leo Sterling, and at 38 years old, I serve as a federal judge in Oregon. On the surface, my life appears to be the kind people aspire to. A comfortable home in the suburbs of Portland, a distinguished career, and a name associated with integrity. From the outside, it all looks quite settled. Yet if you were to ask how I arrived here, the story you'd hear would be anything but straightforward. It's a narrative marked by profound heartache and rejection, filled with moments where I was forced to question my own worth and whether I had a place in the world at all. I was raised in a family whose public image was nothing short of magnificent. In Oregon, the Sterling name was once synonymous with immense wealth and influence. My father, Richard Sterling, was a formidable real estate tycoon who managed Sterling estates with an almost tyrannical grip. My mother, Eleanor, was the picture of grace, a constant, flawless presence at charity functions and elite social gatherings. They had sprawling mansions, took lavish holidays, and commanded a social and professional network that stretched across the nation. But that polished veneer of perfection concealed a reality that was ours alone to bear. The glamorous image was just that, an image. From my earliest memories, I felt like an observer in my own family, a spectator to a life I was technically part of but never truly belonged to. My older brother Ethan was the heir apparent. He was charismatic and sharp, mirroring our father's ambition and ruthlessness in a way that I never could. I was the quieter one, more drawn to books and ideas than to balance sheets and property deeds. My father saw this not as a different path, but as a defect. His approval was a currency I could never seem to earn, each of my achievements met with a dismissive nod or a critical remark that made it feel worthless. "That's fine, Leo," he'd say, "but have you considered what Ethan accomplished this week?" The constant comparison was a weight I carried everywhere. It was a cold and lonely childhood spent in beautiful empty rooms, learning that my value was conditional and always falling short. Despite the persistent chill of his disapproval, a part of me never stopped trying to win him over. I thought if I could just achieve something undeniable, something on his terms, he would finally see me. That desperate hope drove me to excel academically. I graduated at the top of my class from the University of Oregon and then, against staggering odds, earned a place at Stanford Law School. I still remember the phone call, my heart pounding with a foolish mix of pride and anxiety as I told him the news. His response was a brief, sterile congratulations, immediately followed by a question about the networking opportunities. There was no warmth, no pride in his son, only a cold calculation of the potential benefits to the Sterling name. It was then that a painful realization began to settle in my gut. Nothing I ever did would be enough. After graduating from Stanford in 2011, I returned to Portland, my ambition still naively fixed on earning my father's respect. He offered me a position as a junior legal counsel at Sterling Estates, and I accepted, believing it was my chance to finally prove my worth. For 2 years, I poured everything I had into the job, working relentlessly to secure a complex and vital land deal for a new luxury development in Sun River. I navigated every legal obstacle and negotiated every last detail. On the day the deal was set to be finalized, I walked into my father's office, the signed contracts in my hand, feeling a sense of triumph I had never known. But he wasn't alone. My brother Ethan was there, a smirk playing on his lips. My father took the documents from me without a word, his eyes cold as ice. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice flat. "Ethan will be taking over from here. He will be the one to announce the deal." I just stood there, speechless. He then informed me that my position was being eliminated. My own brother, my own father, they had used me, and now they were casting me aside. The humiliation was a physical force sucking the air from my lungs. The next day, the story was splashed across the business section of The Oregonian, with a large photo of Richard and Ethan Sterling celebrating their brilliant new venture. My name was nowhere to be found. It was as if I had never existed. That public erasure was the final, brutal blow. I went home, packed a single bag, and drove to my parents' estate. I found them in the grand living room preparing for another one of their charity dinners. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed my key to the house on the polished mahogany table and told my father I was done. For the first time, I looked him directly in the eye and told him his approval wasn't something I needed anymore. He stared back, his expression unreadable, and simply nodded. My mother, ever the loyal wife, said nothing at all. Her silence was its own form of betrayal. I turned and walked out, closing the door on the Sterling family and the fortune I was never meant to have. Those first few years on my own were the most difficult of my life. I was completely cut off, with no family and no financial safety net. I took on paralegal work and lived in a tiny apartment that felt a world away from the luxury I'd grown up in. But for the first time, I felt a sense of freedom. I was surviving on my own terms. It was during this period that I met Chloe, a kind and brilliant public defender who saw me for who I was, not for the name I had left behind. She became my rock, her belief in me rebuilding my confidence piece by piece. With her encouragement, I took a position with the district attorney's office, where I discovered a true passion for public service. I wasn't just chasing a ghost's approval anymore. I was building something real. Today, my life is quiet, but it is mine. My career as a judge is built not on influence or inheritance, but on a foundation of hard work and a deep commitment to justice. Principles I had to find for myself. I have a loving family with Chloe and our 2 children, a home filled with the warmth and acceptance I never knew as a boy. I haven't spoken to my father or brother since that day I walked out of their lives. Sometimes I see the Sterling Estates logo on a building, a fleeting reminder of a world I once desperately wanted to belong to. But the pain has faded, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the life I was forced to build from the ashes of my old one. I found my place not by inheriting a name, but by earning one. The word home never quite fit the house I grew up in. It was more of a corporate headquarters, a grand stage for the Blackwood legacy, and I was its heir apparent. As the eldest son, my future was charted from birth. I was expected to inherit my father's vast empire. The legend of my grandfather was the gospel in our household. I was told over and over how he had started with nothing more than a tiny office in Vale and through sheer force of will, forged a corporation valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. "You're the one to carry it on, Julian," my father would say, his sharp eyes fixing on me. The words delivered like an unyielding command, not a piece of encouragement. But my own ambitions never aligned with that blueprint. I couldn't see myself reflected in the glass of skyscrapers or in the fine print of million-dollar contracts. My soul came alive in the quiet spaces of books, in the fire of political debate, and in the persistent dream of a world where justice was a living reality, not just a hollow word in a textbook. And to my parents, this deviation felt like a personal betrayal. My quiet passions were a rejection of everything they had built, and their disapproval was a constant, chilling presence in our lives. I can still vividly recall one specific evening at the dinner table when I was 11 years old. The memory is so sharp it feels like it happened yesterday. Our meal was served on a long, polished oak table that felt more like a boardroom fixture than a place for family. Above us, the light from a massive crystal chandelier splintered across the expensive porcelain plates, making everything glitter beautifully while feeling impossibly cold. My father was holding forth about a new condominium project in Aspen, his voice animated with the kind of excitement he usually reserved for his greatest achievements. I was only 11, and the question that slipped out was guileless, born of pure curiosity. "But if you build the new condos there," I asked innocently, "what happens to the poor families who already live in that spot?" The question landed like a stone, shattering the conversation. The entire table fell silent. My mother shot me a look, her brow creased with a sharp, immediate disapproval, as if I'd just cursed. My father, however, just offered a thin, knowing smile. He placed his fork down with deliberate slowness. "Julian," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "you have to learn how to think like a man of business. Compassion doesn't fuel the world." I didn't grasp the full weight of his words then, but the icy disappointment in his tone was unmistakable. It coiled in my stomach. In that moment, under the glare of the chandelier, a chasm opened up between us. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that I would never truly belong in their world. The rest of my childhood unfolded under the weight of that same subtle, unspoken tension. My parents never laid a hand on me or even raised their voices in anger. There was no need. Their disappointment was a far more effective tool of control. A quiet, pervasive judgment that followed me through the grand, empty rooms of our house, constantly reminding me that I was a fundamental disappointment. Their coldness was a constant presence. Their judgmental glances and the endless casual comparisons to my peers in high society were more than enough to instill a deep, abiding sense of failure. "Look at the Harrison boy," my mother once remarked, her voice a soft, silken blade. "He's only 15 and already analyzing financial reports for his father." Her words, though quiet, cut me to the bone. I tried desperately to please them, I truly did. I pushed myself to excel in my studies, I played sports I didn't care for, and I joined the debate club, hoping any achievement might finally earn me a single genuine look of pride. But it was never enough. In their eyes, I was simply a misplaced piece in the otherwise flawless puzzle of the Blackwood dynasty. And then Colton arrived. My younger brother, 3 years my junior, was everything I wasn't. He was born with a swaggering confidence, a quick wit, and an innate talent for the world of business that seemed to flow through his veins. By the time he was 12, my father was already taking him along to company meetings, positioning him in the corner of boardrooms to learn how to be a man. I can still picture the way Colton's eyes would sparkle when he came home from those excursions, practically glowing with the thrill of it all, as if he had just been shown the secrets of the universe. "Julian, you won't believe it," he once told me, his voice bursting with an excitement I could never muster for such things. "I met an investor from New York today. He saw a kingdom waiting for him. I just saw a cage." I forced a smile and patted his shoulder, but a cold, hollow feeling spread through my chest. That was the moment I knew. Colton had just officially become the family's new hope, the rightful heir. Any lingering fantasy I had about my place in their world evaporated. By the time I started high school, the favoritism was no longer subtle. It was an established fact of our lives. All of my parents' attention, energy, and resources were funneled into Colton. He was treated to private outings with my father, given extra lessons in finance, and showered with the kind of praise I had only ever dreamed of receiving. The contrast was stark and painful. I remember winning first place in a statewide debate competition and proudly bringing the trophy home. My mother gave it a cursory glance. "Good job, Julian," she said, her tone dismissive, "but you really ought to focus on more practical skills." A few weeks later, Colton managed to get a B on an economics exam, and my father clapped him on the shoulder, beaming. "That's my boy," he declared with genuine pride. I wasn't jealous of Colton, I swear. I truly loved my brother. But it was impossible not to feel like a ghost in my own home, a faint shadow they barely noticed. The situation deteriorated even further when it was time to choose a path for college. I had my heart set on studying political science at the University of Colorado Boulder, a decision I had researched and dreamed about for years. It felt like the first step toward building a life that was actually my own. I was driven by a deep desire to understand how political systems functioned, to learn how I might contribute to making the world a more just and equitable place. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my parents, their reaction was like a physical blow. It knocked the wind right out of me. "Political science," my father roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings of our cavernous living room. "What in God's name do you think you'll do with that? Become some failed politician? A penniless lawyer begging for cases?" He stepped closer, his face hardening. "The Blackwoods don't raise idealistic dreamers, Julian." My mother, as usual, remained silent, but the look she gave me, a devastating cocktail of disappointment and pity, somehow managed to hurt even more than my father's furious words. I remember that night with perfect clarity. I sat in my room for hours, just staring out the window at the dim streetlights casting long shadows from the trees in our perfectly manicured yard. A wave of doubt washed over me. Was I wrong? Was I being selfish? Maybe I should just give it all up, surrender my dreams and become the son they wanted. But then my mind drifted to the people I'd met at debate tournaments, the powerful stories of injustice I had heard, and the fire in my own gut. A quiet resolve settled over me. I knew I couldn't live a life that wasn't my own, a life designed solely to satisfy their expectations. So I enrolled at the University of Colorado Boulder despite their fierce objections. They didn't explicitly forbid me from going, but what they did instead was far more cruel. They cut me off. Their communication dwindled to curt, icy questions. "Have you eaten? How is school?" The warmth was gone, replaced by a formal chill. I had become a stranger living under their roof. The day I graduated from high school, I packed my things and moved out to begin my freshman year. My parents didn't contribute a single dollar. I covered every expense from my tuition to the rent on a tiny apartment, by cobbling together scholarships and working a grueling part-time job at a campus coffee shop. It was a struggle every single day. Meanwhile, Colton was sent off to a prestigious business school in Boston, his every need lavishly covered by our parents. I never blamed Colton for a second. He was just living the life that had been designed for him, pursuing his own passion. But every time my mother would get off the phone, beaming about how Colton had been invited to some exclusive business gala, or when my father would boast to his friends about an impressive internship contract Colton had secured, a sharp, familiar pain would pierce my heart. It wasn't just that I had lost my family's financial support. I felt like I had lost my very place in the world, the fundamental sense of belonging somewhere. My college years were defined by a profound and persistent loneliness. To cope, I poured every ounce of my energy into my studies, into debate tournaments, and into the dense, complex world of law books. It was there, buried in legal theory and precedent, that I finally found my calling. I discovered that I loved the law, not for the potential of money or fame, but for the clarity it offered, the framework it provided for doing what was right. It gave me a purpose that felt solid and true. I started to dream of one day standing in a courtroom not to protect a corporation's interests, but to defend the very principle of justice itself. That dream became my North Star. Yet every time I returned home for the holidays, I was met with the same Arctic reception, cold stares across the dinner table and thinly veiled cutting remarks. "Still haven't changed your mind, Julian?" my father once asked during Christmas break, his voice dripping with a thick, familiar sarcasm. "Still planning to be a hero for the downtrodden?" I learned to stay silent, to absorb the blows without flinching. but inside his scorn only stoked the fire of my determination, making it burn hotter and brighter. After finishing my undergraduate degree, I pushed forward, committing to another 3 grueling years to earn my law degree. That period was, without question, the most difficult of my life. I worked constantly, a relentless cycle of studying all day and taking on menial side jobs all night just to cover my expenses. There were nights I survived on only 3 or 4 hours of sleep, my brain buzzing with legal codes and the endless complexities of hypothetical cases. But I never once considered giving up. I knew with every fiber of my being that this was my path, no matter how solitary it was. During those same years, Colton began working at my father's corporation. He was immediately entrusted with major projects and publicly celebrated as the perfect successor, the brilliant future of Blackwood Industries. In the stories my parents told their friends and associates, it was as if they only had one son. I had been completely written out of the family narrative. I was a faded photograph, a smudge on the otherwise pristine portrait of the Blackwood family. I had simply ceased to exist for them. Then the day after I graduated from law school, my degree clutched in my hand like a shield. My father summoned me home. As I walked into his imposing study, a foolish, flickering hope ignited within me. Maybe this was it. Maybe he was finally ready to reconcile, to acknowledge my hard work, to say the words I had longed to hear my entire life, that he was proud of me. But he didn't. Instead, he pushed a thick legal file across his massive desk. "We have a dispute with a group of our construction workers," he said, his tone all business. "You will represent the company." I took the file, my hands trembling slightly, and began to read. With every page I turned, my heart sank lower until it felt like a stone in my chest. My father's company had been systematically exploiting its most vulnerable workers, paying them far below the legal minimum wage, and then illegally firing anyone who had the courage to speak up. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. The next day, I walked back into his study. I placed the file squarely on his desk and looked him in the eye. "I can't do this," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "What the company did is wrong." My father stared at me, his face slowly turning a deep shade of red, his eyes burning with a furious, incandescent rage. "Wrong?" he growled, the word low and dangerous. "Who the hell do you think you are, Julian? Some self-righteous knight of justice? This is your family, this is your legacy." I tried to explain my reasoning, to appeal to some sense of morality I hoped was buried deep inside him, but he wouldn't listen. He wasn't interested in a debate. He rose to his full height, his shadow falling over me. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "If you refuse to stand with this family," he said, his voice dangerously low, "then you are no longer my son." My mother stood by his side, silent as always, but this time I saw tears glistening in her eyes before she quickly looked away. I turned without another word and walked out, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. As I left, the heavy iron gate of the estate slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon air, a final definitive punctuation mark on my connection to the Blackwood family. I found myself on a bustling street in downtown Aspen, the biting chill of the autumn air seeping through my coat. I just stood there for a long time, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, watching the endless stream of people hurry past, each lost in their own world. A single overwhelming question echoed in my mind. Where do I go from here? I had no family to turn to, no financial safety net, nothing but a freshly printed law degree and an unshakable, perhaps naive, belief that justice was something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. That moment marked the true beginning of the next chapter of my life. It was the start of a 7-year journey. 7 years of true independence, filled with hardship and struggle, but also the very years that forged me into the man I am today. Those first few days after being officially cast out by my family were a strange, disorienting mix of exhilarating freedom and crushing loneliness. I felt untethered, floating in a new and unfamiliar reality. I found a tiny apartment in a less than desirable suburb of Portland, a place where the peeling paint on the walls and the persistent musty smell of old carpeting served as a constant, tangible reminder of the vast gulf between my new life and the opulent mansions of my past. My meager savings would barely cover a few months' rent, so the job search began with a desperate urgency. I ended up applying to a small, underfunded law office in the city center that specialized in handling civil cases for low-income clients. It was the furthest thing from a glamorous position. The office was crammed onto the third floor of a creaky old building where the ancient elevator protested with a loud squeal on every trip up or down. My new colleagues were mostly young, idealistic lawyers, all struggling to make ends meet just like me. But it was in that cramped, chaotic office that I finally, truly found my purpose. On my very first day, I was handed a case file. It involved a single mother who was facing eviction from her apartment after her landlord claimed she had failed to pay rent. The story was more complicated than that, and she was terrified of ending up on the street with her child. I was determined to help her. I sat across from her in our tiny windowless meeting room, listening intently as she spoke, her voice strained with exhaustion. She told me about her 2 young children, about her sleepless nights spent consumed with worry. "I just don't know what to do, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling, her hands twisting in her lap. I looked into her tired, frightened eyes, and in that moment I understood something profound. The law wasn't just dry, abstract text in a book. It was a living, breathing tool that had the power to fundamentally change a person's life for the better. I poured everything I had into that case. I worked day and night, poring over Oregon's complex housing laws, digging through archives for legal precedents, and preparing my arguments. In the end, we won. The judge ruled in her favor. The mother threw her arms around me, tears of pure relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never ever thought I had a chance." That feeling, the raw, overwhelming gratitude in her voice, was more valuable than any inheritance. I knew with absolute certainty that I had chosen the right path. But life wasn't a constant stream of sweet victories. There were many days when I worked until I was physically and emotionally exhausted, only to return to my cold, empty apartment and wonder if I had the strength to get up and do it all again the next day. The meager salary, the piling bills, and the long, lonely nights spent staring into a cold cup of coffee often led my thoughts back to my former life in the Blackwood household. It was a tempting ghost. I didn't miss the luxury, not really. What I missed was the simple human feeling of having someone else there, of not being completely alone in the world. I never called my parents, and they never once reached out to me. Our silence was a wall between us. Occasionally, I would see their names in the news. Blackwood Industries announces major expansion in Vail, or Colton Blackwood honored as a promising young entrepreneur. Each headline felt like a twist of an invisible knife in my gut, a painful reminder of the world I had been exiled from. But I would always push the feeling down, steeling myself with a familiar mantra. I don't need them. I will make it on my own. For the first 3 years, I worked like a machine. I was relentless. I took on every single case that came through the door, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, from minor contract disputes to defending the rights of exploited workers. I was learning on the fly, honing my skills in the crucible of real-world law. I learned how to truly listen to my clients, how to argue effectively in a courtroom, and how to stand my ground against seasoned, powerful lawyers who looked at me and saw nothing but a naive, idealistic kid. But I wasn't naive. I had a fire burning inside me, a fire forged in the furnace of my family's disdain, fueled by my father's sneering words that I would never amount to anything. Every case I won felt like a victory not just for my client but for me. It was another small step toward proving them all wrong. By my 4th year at the firm, my reputation had started to spread throughout Portland's legal community. People were beginning to notice. People started calling me the poor man's lawyer, a nickname that made me feel both proud and a little amused. I wasn't working for fame or recognition, but I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that came from finally earning the respect of my peers. One day I received an invitation to speak at a legal conference in Bend. It was a huge step for me. For the first time in my career, I stood before an audience of hundreds of lawyers and judges, sharing my thoughts on the critical role of the law in protecting society's most vulnerable. I spoke from the heart. When I finished my speech, the entire room rose to their feet in a standing ovation. It was surreal. Afterwards, an elderly, highly respected judge named Marcus Thorne made his way through the crowd to shake my hand. "You have the makings of a great judge, Julian," he said, his eyes sharp but kind. "Keep on this path, and you will go very far." His words were like a powerful gust of wind filling my tattered sails, giving me a renewed sense of strength and purpose to press forward. Then, in my 5th year of practice, an unexpected and extraordinary opportunity presented itself. A position for a state judgeship in Oregon opened up. It was a turning point I hadn't even dared to dream of. The application process was incredibly grueling, a marathon of interviews, background checks, and intense scrutiny. I knew the odds were stacked against me. I faced intense interviews, probing questions about professional ethics and thinly veiled doubts about whether I was too young and inexperienced for such a significant role. But I persevered, bolstered by my robust track record and the glowing recommendations from colleagues who had seen my dedication firsthand. Against all odds, I made it through. The day the official appointment letter arrived, I sat alone in my small apartment, holding the heavy cream-colored paper in my hands, and I wept. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and a profound sense of accomplishment. I cried because I finally truly understood how far I had come. From a boy who had been dismissed as a failure by his own family, I had become a judge. A person entrusted with the immense power to decide the fate of cases and, by extension, the lives of people. Being a judge was a world away from being a lawyer. Sitting elevated in the judge's chair for the first time, I felt the immense, almost crushing weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. Every single ruling was a profound test of my commitment to fairness, a challenge to hold fast to my principles even under intense pressure. Some cases were particularly difficult and kept me awake at night, their details replaying in my mind. I remember one involving a desperate father who was accused of theft simply to feed his hungry children. In that moment, I had to find a delicate balance between compassion and the letter of the law, weighing the human impulse to give him a second chance against the societal need to uphold order. But with every difficult ruling, I would remind myself, this is why I chose this path. I am here to uphold justice, not to please anyone. It became my mantra. Over the course of those 7 years, I didn't just build a career, I built an entirely new life from the ground up. I forged deep friendships with colleagues who shared my core beliefs about justice and public service. I started getting involved in community activities like teaching basic law classes for free to high school students in underprivileged neighborhoods. I even bought a beat-up old bicycle and spent my weekends exploring the trails around Portland, savoring the crisp Pacific Northwest air. I learned how to cook for myself, mostly through a series of comical failures, and discovered a quiet joy in simple pleasures like reading a book by the window on a rainy afternoon. But no matter how full and meaningful my life became, there was still a small, persistent void inside me, an emptiness I couldn't quite fill. I had absolutely no contact with my family, yet I couldn't deny the fact that I missed them. I missed my mother. I missed Colton. And strangely, in a way that was difficult to admit even to myself, I missed my father. Occasionally, I would catch a snippet of news about Colton. He had been promoted to vice president of Blackwood Industries and was being lauded in business journals as a rising star, a true prodigy. The news always brought a complicated mix of emotions. It seemed my parents had invested all their hopes and dreams in him, erasing me from their history as if I had never been born. I wasn't jealous of his success, but I often found myself wondering if Colton was genuinely happy living under our father's immense shadow, or if he too was struggling with the weight of those expectations, just as I once had. I wanted so badly to call him, just to hear his voice, to see how he was really doing. But every time I picked up the phone, a wave of doubt and old pain would wash over me, and I would hesitate. They don't need me, I would tell myself, and force myself to move on, to continue living the life I had built. By my 7th year of independence, I had become a respected judge in Oregon. My name now appeared in the news not as a Blackwood heir, but as Judge Julian Sterling, a man known for his commitment to justice. I received thank you letters from people whose lives I had touched, and from young lawyers who told me they saw me as a role model. These moments were my true reward. But I never forgot the hard days that had brought me here, the lonely nights, the constant struggle, and the countless times I had to pick myself up after being knocked down. I knew that no matter how successful I became, I would always carry the scars from my family. They were a permanent part of me, a constant reminder of the steep and painful price I had paid to become the man I am today. I never could have imagined that after 7 long years of silence, fate would conspire to bring me face to face with my family again. It wouldn't be a warm, tearful reunion, but a cold, formal confrontation in a courtroom, a place where I would be forced to issue a ruling on the fate of my own brother. It was a moment that I knew, with sickening certainty, would test everything I had built, my career, my principles, my very sense of self, in the most brutal and public way imaginable. That morning I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, my hands fumbling as I tried to adjust my tie. I focused on keeping my breathing steady, in and out, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. My black judge's robe lay neatly folded on a nearby chair, waiting for me to put it on. But today it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I had presided over hundreds of trials in my career, handling everything from petty theft to complex financial fraud. But never before had my heart pounded with such violent, suffocating intensity. Today, the defendant was not a stranger. It was Colton Blackwood, my younger brother. The little boy I once carried on my shoulders, the one I used to shoot hoops with in the sprawling backyard of our childhood home. And now, he was about to stand before me in my courtroom, accused of massive financial fraud in a case inextricably tied to our family's corporation. I walked into the courtroom at the Oregon State Courthouse, the familiar air thick with the scent of old wood polish and the low, expectant murmurs of the assembled crowd. Every seat was taken. The gallery was packed with journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers, all of them eager to witness the trial of the city's fallen business star, Colton Blackwood. I took my place at the bench, my gaze sweeping deliberately across the room, and then my eyes found them. My father and mother sitting in the front row. My father, Richard Blackwood, still projected an aura of absolute authority in his impeccably tailored suit. But his face looked more haggard than I remembered. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by worry. My mother, Eleanor, looked frail and small beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted around the room, flickering between raw anxiety and a desperate, fragile hope. They didn't look at me. Not once. There was no nod, no flicker of recognition. I was the judge presiding over the case, but in their eyes, I was still the family traitor. I took a deep breath, struck the gavel, and the trial began. The prosecutor rose to her feet, her voice sharp and clear as she began to lay out the charges against my brother. Colton stood accused of systematically manipulating Blackwood Industries' accounting records, funneling millions of dollars into clandestine offshore accounts to evade taxes and conceal illicit profits from a series of shady real estate deals. The evidence presented was overwhelming. A trail of incriminating emails, damning bank documents, and sworn testimony from several former employees who had been coerced into silence. I listened intently, my pen scratching across my notepad, but my mind kept betraying me, drifting back through time. I saw flashes of Colton at 10 years old, his little legs pumping as he ran after me in the park, his face lit up with a huge, gap-toothed grin when I would slow down just enough to let him win the race. How did that joyful, innocent boy become the man sitting at the defendant's table? How had he come to this? Colton's defense attorney, a slick, confident man in his 50s, argued that the whole affair was nothing more than a series of unfortunate accounting errors, a colossal misunderstanding, and that his client had absolutely no criminal intent. But when I looked directly at my brother, I saw something else entirely. This was not the carefree boy from my memories. His gaze was shifty and evasive, his shoulders perpetually hunched forward as if he were carrying an immense, invisible weight. A cold thought settled in my gut. Was this the true price of living up to our father's crushing expectations? The trial dragged on throughout the day, a grueling marathon of tense arguments and counter-arguments from both sides. I maintained a calm, impassive exterior, my face a carefully constructed mask of judicial neutrality. But inside, a fierce and agonizing battle was raging. Every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution felt like another twist of the knife, not just in Colton, but in the entire Blackwood family and the gilded legacy my father had always held up as his life's greatest achievement. When the court finally recessed for the day, I retreated to the solitude of my chambers, shut the door, and sank into my chair, burying my head in my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm down to the holding cells and grab Colton by the shoulders and yell, "Why, little brother? Why did you let it go this far?" But I couldn't. I was the judge. My duty was to the law, to justice, not to the swirling vortex of emotions that threatened to pull me under. On the second day of the trial, just before the morning session was set to begin, I received a message from the court clerk. "Someone is here to see you, Judge Sterling." I nodded, assuming it was one of the lawyers with a last-minute motion. But when my chamber door opened, it was my mother who walked in. She was wearing a simple gray sweater, a garment far plainer and more subdued than the glamorous designer dresses I remembered from her past. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I just talk to you for a moment?" I gestured numbly for her to sit, but my heart seized in my chest. This was the first time we had spoken a single word to each other in 7 years. Are you doing well?" she asked, her eyes searching my face as if desperately trying to find a trace of the boy I used to be. I managed a stiff nod. "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, my tone more curt than I intended. She fell silent for a long moment, wringing her hands in her lap. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Colton, he didn't mean for any of this to happen, Julian. He was just under so much pressure. Your father. He put so many expectations on him. You know how he is. You know that, don't you?" I looked at her, my resolve wavering, and fought to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I cannot discuss this case with you. I am the judge." She nodded slowly, but her eyes were pleading, desperate. I know. I I just want you to remember that Colton is your brother. Family is everything, Julian." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I simply stood, walked to the door, and opened it. "You should go back to your seat," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "The trial is about to resume." As she walked out, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I felt a piece of my carefully constructed armor crack and splinter. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I allowed my emotions to take over, I would lose everything I had worked for. On the third day of the trial, my father made his move. He didn't approach me directly, of course. That wasn't his style. He sent an intermediary, Marcus Thorne, the retired judge who had praised my work and encouraged me all those years ago. The betrayal stung more than I could have imagined. Thorne entered my chambers with a warm, familiar smile, but I could immediately sense that something was off. "Julian," he said, his voice lowered conspiratorially, "I hear you're handling a rather big case." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "You know, a judge's career can sometimes depend on how they navigate sensitive situations." I felt my brow furrow, and I asked him bluntly, "What exactly do you mean by that, Marcus?" He let out a soft chuckle and patted my shoulder in a fatherly way that now felt deeply condescending. "Just a bit of friendly advice, young man. Sometimes a little leniency can save a person a great deal of trouble down the road." I understood instantly. This was my father's work, his signature move, using his powerful connections to apply pressure to intimidate me into compliance. I stood up and looked him directly in the eye, my voice cold and hard. "Thank you for the advice, Judge," I said, "but I will be handling this case according to the letter of the law. There will be no exceptions." He left without another word, his friendly smile completely gone, and I knew I had just stared down an implicit threat. But the pressure from my family didn't stop there. It was relentless. One evening, after a particularly draining day in court, I returned home to find a handwritten letter tucked inside my mailbox. I recognized my mother's elegant looping script immediately, the same handwriting I remembered from birthday and Christmas cards when I was a child. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. With every line I read, I felt myself being pulled back into the suffocating emotional vortex of my past. She wrote about sun-drenched mornings when Colton and I would race out to play in the yard, about the time he fell from his bike and I carried him all the way home on my back, his small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. "You and your brother were our whole world," she wrote at the end. "Please, Julian, don't let this idea of justice destroy what's left of our family." I sat there in the quiet of my living room, the letter trembling in my hands. I knew this wasn't just a mother's heartfelt plea, it was a calculated tactic, a deliberate attempt to manipulate me with guilt. I didn't respond. I simply folded the letter, tucked it away in a drawer, and repeated my mantra over and over again. I cannot let them sway me. The trial finally reached its critical phase. The prosecutor presented her final, most damning piece of evidence, an email sent from Colton's own account to a junior colleague, explicitly instructing them to adjust the numbers on a financial report to protect the company's reputation ahead of a major merger. It was the smoking gun. I looked over at Colton, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes, hoping he would deny it, claim it was a forgery, anything. But he just bowed his head, defeated, silent. His defense attorney scrambled to spin a new narrative, but it was useless. The evidence was simply overwhelming. A sharp physical pain pierced my chest. Not just because I knew Colton was likely going to be convicted, but because I knew, with a sickening finality, that he was guilty. I realized in that moment that my brother had gone too far, that he had allowed himself to be swept away by a toxic combination of ambition and our father's relentless pressure. As the trial drew to its inevitable conclusion, I allowed Colton to make a final statement to the court. He stood, his hands shaking, his voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to make my parents proud," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I only did what I thought was necessary to succeed." His words cut through me like shards of glass. I glanced over at my parents in the front row. My mother had bowed her head, silent tears streaming down her face. My father, for the first time, looked broken. He sat ramrod straight, but his eyes were vacant, hollow, as if he were finally truly seeing the devastating consequences of his actions, the wreckage he had made of his own son. I struck the gavel, called a recess, and retreated to my chambers. I needed time. I needed to breathe, to somehow sort through the chaotic storm of emotions swirling inside me before I had to render my verdict. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat by my window all night, watching the dim streetlights cast a pale, lonely glow on the empty street below. I thought about Colton. I thought about my parents. I replayed the entire story of our family in my head, trying to pinpoint all the moments that had led us to this terrible, tragic place. I knew that my ruling would change everything, not just for Colton, but for all of us. It would be the final shattering blow to a family that was already broken. But I also knew with a certainty that went bone deep that if I failed to uphold my principles now, I would lose the very core of who I had become. Tomorrow I would walk into that courtroom, put on my black robe, and deliver my verdict. I would not be acting as a brother, but as a judge. I would be a guardian of the law, even if it meant breaking my own heart in the process. The morning of the final day of the trial arrived, gray and overcast. I stood just outside the courtroom doors, my hands gripping the thick fabric of my black robe. My breathing was labored, shallow, as if the very air in the corridor of the Oregon State Courthouse was too heavy, pressing down on my chest. Today was the last day. Today I would pass judgment on my brother. I knew the verdict I was about to deliver would not only determine his future, but would also forever sever my relationship with my family, if there was even anything left of it to sever. 7 years of determined silence, 7 years spent painstakingly building a life of my own, all of it had somehow led me to this single impossible moment. I was a judge, standing at the brutal intersection of justice and blood. I took a final deep breath and pushed the heavy door open. The creak of the old wooden frame echoed through the silent hallway like a somber warning. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Journalists were clustered in the left-hand corner, their pens scratching furiously in their notepads, their cameras discreetly capturing every flicker of emotion. The gallery was packed with curious onlookers, all drawn by the spectacle of the trial of the city's fallen golden boy, Colton Blackwood. They whispered amongst themselves, creating a low, persistent hum, like waves lapping against a desolate shore. And there, in the front row, sat my father and mother, separated by a chasm of unspoken grief. My father, Richard Blackwood, maintained his usual stoic, unyielding demeanor, but from my vantage point I could see his shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly, a rare crack in his iron facade. My mother, Eleanor, looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and she clutched a crumpled white handkerchief in her trembling hands. Neither of them looked directly at me, but I could feel their gazes on me all the same, like invisible needles pricking my skin. I took my seat at the bench and struck the gavel. The sharp, authoritative crack of the wood cut through the room, commanding an immediate silence. "We will now continue the trial of Colton Blackwood," I announced, my voice miraculously steady despite the violent storm raging inside me. The prosecutor, a sharp, formidable woman named Sarah Jenkins, stood. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing with clarity. "Today we would like to present our final piece of evidence. A document we believe will fully clarify the defendant's actions and intent. I nodded, signaling for her to proceed, but as Ms. Jenkins stepped forward, my eyes were drawn to Colton at the defendant's table. His head was bowed low, his hands clasped together so tightly on the table in front of him that his knuckles had turned white. He looked utterly trapped, a pale shadow of the confident entrepreneur the press had once lauded, and an even fainter echo of the quick-witted, joyful boy who used to chase me around our backyard. He just looked small. I had to force that image from my mind, repeating the same stern reminder I'd been using for days. You are a judge, Julian, not a brother. Ms. Jenkins presented a set of documents, each page stamped with bold red numbers. These are internal reports from Blackwood Industries, she explained. Provided to us by an unexpected witness, Ms. Catherine Reed, the company's former chief accountant. A low buzz of surprise rippled through the courtroom. I struck my gavel again, demanding order, but my own eyes were fixed on the documents. Catherine Reed. The name echoed faintly in my memory. I remembered her, a quiet, dedicated woman in her 50s who had worked for my father since I was a boy. She had retired a few years ago, and now here she was emerging as a game-changing witness in the trial of my brother. Ms. Reed took the witness stand, her small, unassuming frame a stark contrast to the resolute look in her eyes. She swore her oath to tell the truth, and as Ms. Jenkins began her questioning, the air in the room seemed to grow thick and heavy with anticipation. Ms. Reed, Jenkins asked, can you please explain these documents to the court? Ms. Reed nodded, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. These are internal financial records I discovered while I was still employed at Blackwood Industries, she stated clearly. They show unequivocally that Colton Blackwood directed the transfer of company funds to a series of offshore accounts, not only to evade corporate taxes but also to conceal profits from a number of illegal real estate transactions. She paused, took a breath, and delivered the final blow. I brought these irregularities to the attention of Mr. Richard Blackwood, but he instructed me to stay silent and ignore them. The courtroom erupted. Shocked whispers instantly escalated into muffled shouts, and I had to strike my gavel repeatedly to restore order. I shot a glance at my father. For the first time in my entire life, I saw him completely stripped of his arrogant confidence. His face was ashen. His lips pressed into a thin, tight line, as if he had just been dealt a devastating physical blow. My mother reached for his hand, but he shook her off, his eyes laser-focused on Ms. Reed with an expression of pure, venomous disbelief. I knew exactly what he was thinking. How could a loyal, trusted employee dare to stand up against the Blackwood family? I looked back at Colton, desperately hoping he would finally stand up, deny the accusations, offer some kind of explanation, anything. But he just sat there, his head bowed even lower than before, as if he were trying to will himself to disappear completely. His defense attorney, a man named Michael Holt, tried to mount a counterattack, weakly suggesting that Ms. Reed might have fabricated the documents out of some personal resentment or a desire for revenge. But it was a feeble attempt. The evidence was simply too strong, too detailed, and too damning to dismiss. I continued to take notes, my hand shaking so badly I could barely form the words. My heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. This wasn't just a legal case anymore, it was the entire tragic story of my family laid bare for the world to see. The story of my parents' moral failures and of the unbearable pressure that had ultimately driven Colton down this destructive path. The trial became even more intense than I had anticipated. By late afternoon, I called on both sides to present their closing arguments. Ms. Jenkins delivered a powerful summation, emphasizing that Colton's actions were not just a matter of financial fraud, but a profound betrayal of the trust of his employees, his investors, and the public. Mr. Holt, in his turn, made a desperate appeal to compassion, painting Colton as a victim of immense family pressure, a young man who deserved a chance to make amends for his mistakes. I listened, I took notes, but in the back of my mind a single agonizing question echoed on a loop. What do I do now? When the time finally came for me to deliver my verdict, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the room. I stood, the black robe feeling heavier than ever on my shoulders, and my voice rang out, somehow calm and resolute, into the charged silence. After a thorough review of all the evidence and testimony presented in this case, I began. This court finds the defendant, Colton Blackwood, guilty of all charges, including financial fraud and money laundering. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Under the relevant Oregon state and federal statutes, the defendant is hereby sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and is ordered to pay $2.5 million in restitution to the affected parties. I paused, my eyes locking with Colton's for the first time. The law, I said, my voice unwavering, does not distinguish between blood ties. Justice must be served. The room was utterly silent for a moment, the stillness broken only by the sound of my mother's choked sobs. Colton's shoulders began to shake, his head still bowed in shame. Then my father stood up abruptly. He turned and stormed out of the courtroom without a single glance in my direction. My mother remained in her seat, her face buried in her hands, her body racked with grief, as if her entire world had just collapsed around her. The press corps erupted into a frenzy of scribbling, and I could already hear the whispers starting to circulate. "Judge Sterling," they were saying. The man who showed no mercy, not even to his own brother. I struck the gavel one last time, officially ending the trial. And then I turned and walked from the courtroom, each step feeling like it carried the weight of lead. Back in the sanctuary of my chambers, I closed the door, slowly removed my robe, and sank heavily into my chair. I didn't cry. I had learned to suppress my tears a long, long time ago, but I felt a vast, hollow emptiness open up inside me. I had done the right thing. I knew that with every fiber of my being. So why did it hurt so damn much? I stared out the window, watching the late afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the Portland skyline, and I wondered if my family would ever understand. Would they ever believe that I had done this not out of hatred or revenge, but out of a deep and abiding belief in the principles of justice? Or would I forever be the villain in their story? That night, I didn't go home right away. I just drove aimlessly until I found myself on the outskirts of the city, parked on a quiet road with a clear view of Mount Hood. I stepped out of the car, the biting cold of the night air a welcome shock to my system, and looked up at the vast star-filled sky. I thought about Colton, about the long-lost years when we were just brothers, and I thought about my parents, who I knew would likely never speak to me again, let alone forgive me. But then I thought about the people my verdict had protected, the small-time investors who had lost their savings, the exploited employees who had been cheated out of their wages, all the people who still believed in the promise of the legal system. And in that quiet, lonely moment, I knew that no matter the personal cost, I had made the only choice I could have. The days following the verdict passed in a strange, surreal haze, an atmosphere I had never experienced before, despite having presided over hundreds of complex and high-profile cases. The press was having a field day with my brother's case, writing endless articles that painted me as the judge of justice, praising my unwavering impartiality and my refusal to show leniency, even toward my own flesh and blood. Those articles should have made me feel proud, but each laudatory line served only as a painful public reminder that I had traded my family for that reputation. About a week after the sentencing, my father made his first public move. It was exactly what I had expected. In a front-page interview on the Oregonian, he delivered his own verdict. Julian Sterling, he was quoted as saying, his words cold and final, is not my son. He betrayed his family. I sat at my kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, and read every single word in the newspaper. Julian chose to side with strangers over his own family, my father had said. He probably thinks he's some kind of hero, but he's just a selfish man who has destroyed the legacy my father and I worked our entire lives to build. The words themselves didn't surprise me, but they still managed to cut into my heart like a well-honed blade. I was accustomed to my father's criticism, but this time it was different. This time it was public. A declaration of war laid bare for the entire world to see. He had branded me a traitor, framing my actions as a deliberate, malicious attack on our family, as if I hadn't agonized for sleepless nights over the verdict I had been forced to deliver. The public's reaction, however, was the complete opposite of what my father likely intended. His interview backfired, sparking a wave of controversy and debate on social media. Hundreds of posts began appearing, with total strangers coming to my defense. Judge Sterling did the right thing. Justice should have no room for favoritism, one popular post read. Another one put it even more bluntly. Richard Blackwood should be reflecting on how he pushed his own son down the wrong path instead of blaming the one who actually upheld the law. I'm not the kind of person who spends time on social media, but my court clerk, a kind woman named Emily, printed out a few of the more supportive posts and handed them to me. "You should read these, Judge," she said, a small, encouraging smile on her lips. "The people are on your side." I managed a weak smile in return, but I felt no sense of triumph. The support of strangers, while appreciated, couldn't begin to fill the vast gaping void left by the loss of my family. My mother's reaction was very different. She didn't go to the press or publicly condemn me like my father had. Instead, about 2 weeks after the trial, I received a phone call from her. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the answer button, before I finally picked up. "Julian." Her voice came through the line, frail but surprisingly warm. Can I see you?" I was silent for a moment, my heart suddenly racing. After 7 years of absolute silence, after everything that had just happened in that courtroom, I wasn't sure I was ready to face her, but I heard myself agreeing anyway. "This afternoon," I said, my voice sounding hoarse and distant, "at the coffee shop on Pearl Street." The cafe was a place I frequented on weekends, a quiet little corner spot with exposed brick walls and the rich, comforting aroma of freshly roasted coffee. It felt like neutral ground. When I arrived, my mother was already there, sitting at a small table by the window with a cup of untouched tea in front of her. She looked much older than she had just a few weeks ago in the courtroom. Her hair seemed grayer, her shoulders more frail beneath a simple beige sweater. As I sat down across from her, she looked up, her eyes seeming to hold 1,000 unspoken words, but she seemed unsure of where to even begin. "Are you doing well, Julian?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle, a tone I hadn't heard her use with me since I was a child. I simply nodded, trying to keep a tight rein on my emotions. "I'm fine, Mom." She offered a small, sad smile in return. "I've been reading the articles about you," she said quietly. "They're calling you a hero, but I know this wasn't easy for you." I didn't respond, just stared down at the dark surface of the coffee in my cup, waiting. I knew she hadn't asked to meet me just for small talk. She took a deep, shaky breath. "I was wrong, Julian," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Your father and we were wrong. We put so much pressure on you and Colton. I always thought that if we just pushed you both onto the path we had chosen, you would be happy and successful. I see now how foolish that was." Her admission left me stunned. Growing up, my mother had never, not once, admitted to being wrong about anything. She had always stood silently behind my father, a loyal and unwavering supporter of his decisions, no matter how harsh or unfair they were. When I saw Colton in that courtroom, she continued, her voice trembling with emotion, I realized that I had played a part in pushing him down that terrible path. And you did the right thing, Julian. You did the right thing, no matter how painful it must have been. I looked at her, my mind reeling, and struggled to find my own words. My throat felt tight, constricted. Mom, I finally managed to say, I never wanted to hurt anyone. But I couldn't let my personal feelings sway my verdict. If I had done that, I would have lost myself completely. She nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, she whispered, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I know. And I am so proud of you, Julian. I wish we hadn't let things get this far. Our meeting lasted for less than an hour, but it fundamentally changed something inside of me. For the first time in years, I felt a faint, fragile connection to my mother. It wasn't a full reconciliation. We were still light years away from that, but it was a start. It was a sign that she was finally beginning to understand me, to understand the principles I had fought so hard to uphold. As we stood to leave, she took my hand and squeezed it gently. I'll always be here for you, Julian, she said, if you ever need me. I didn't respond with words, but I gave her a small nod. And as I watched her walk out of the cafe, I felt a small part of the heavy burden I had been carrying in my heart for years begin to lift. 2 years have passed since Colton's trial, and my life has changed in ways I never could have anticipated. I still live in my small, comfortable apartment in the suburbs of Portland. I still ride my old beat-up bicycle along the tree-lined streets on the weekends. But I am no longer the Julian Sterling of 7 years ago, the lost, lonely young man who was desperately struggling to prove his own worth. Now I am a federal judge, a significant milestone in a career that I built with my own sweat and tears. But more important than the title, I have found a sense of inner peace, a kind of quiet freedom that I never even knew I needed until after I had lost my family. The day I was officially appointed as a federal judge was an unforgettable milestone in my life. The investiture ceremony took place at the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, a majestic old building with towering marble columns and an atmosphere of profound solemnity. It was a day I will never forget. My colleagues, my friends, and even some of the people I had helped through my work over the years were all there, their applause echoing through the grand hall as I stepped forward to receive my official letter of appointment. And there, sitting quietly in the third row, I saw my mother. She was wearing a simple light blue dress, a faint but genuine smile on her lips. She had come alone. My father, of course, was absent. I wasn't surprised, but her quiet, supportive presence was more than enough to warm my heart. After the ceremony, my mother made her way through the crowd and approached me, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled me into a hug. "Julian," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I am so proud of you. You chose your own path, and I admire you so much for it." Those words, so simple but so utterly sincere, were something I never in my life thought I would hear from her. I hugged her back tightly, feeling the warmth of a maternal embrace I had longed for my entire childhood. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt that I could finally forgive, not just her, but myself as well. In the 2 years that followed Colton's trial, I began to visit him regularly in prison. Those visits were never easy. Colton, now nearly 2 years into his 3-year sentence, always kept a palpable distance between us. He would sit across from me behind a thick pane of reinforced glass, his eyes vacant and hollow, often responding to my questions with clipped one-word phrases. "I'm fine," he would say whenever I asked how he was doing, but I could see the deep-seated bitterness in his gaze. He blamed me. I knew he blamed me for everything that had happened. Once I brought an old photograph of the two of us taken during a summer vacation we'd had on the Oregon coast, hoping it might stir some warm, forgotten memories between us. "I miss those days," I said, sliding the faded photo through the small slot in the glass. Colton glanced at it for a brief moment, then pushed it back toward me, his voice as cold as ice. "Those days don't mean anything anymore, Julian," he said flatly. "You chose your justice over your own brother." His words cut me like a knife, but I didn't argue. I just nodded, said, "I'll be back next month," and left carrying an indescribable aching pain in my chest. Still, I refused to give up on him. I kept visiting month after month. I brought him books to read. I told him about the cases I was handling, and sometimes we would just sit there in silence for the entire hour, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between us. I had to believe that one day he would understand. I held on to the faint, flickering hope that one day he would finally understand that I hadn't convicted him out of hatred or malice, but because I truly believed that facing justice was the only way for him to truly confront his mistakes and begin to make amends. What brought me a quiet sense of comfort during this time was that my mother slowly began to re-enter my life. She would occasionally send me emails, asking about my work and my health, and sometimes she would share updates about her own visits to see Colton. Once, she invited me to have dinner with her at an old restaurant our family used to frequent when I was a child. We sat across from each other eating the same steak dinner I used to love, and for the first time in my adult life we talked like friends, not like a mother and son separated by a wall of invisible barriers. "It took me years to understand you, Julian," she said, her eyes glinting with a deep, sincere regret. "But I'm so happy you found your own path." I smiled, reached across the table, and took her hand. "I'm happy you're here too, Mom," I said. But with my father, the door to any kind of reconciliation remained firmly, irrevocably shut. He continued to live in his own self-contained world, a world where the Blackwood legacy was everything, and I was the traitor who had single-handedly destroyed it. I didn't try to reach out to him, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew with a weary certainty that he wasn't ready to listen. Perhaps one day in his old age he might look back and realize that family isn't about reputation or power or legacy, but about love and understanding. But I'm not waiting for that day to come. I have finally learned to live without his approval. Now, as I sit in my quiet office at the federal courthouse looking out at the Portland skyline with the misty peak of Mount Hood in the distance, I often find myself reflecting on my long and winding journey. I went from being a boy who was deemed a failure by his own family, to a scrappy young lawyer fighting for the vulnerable, to a respected federal judge. But my true legacy, I know, isn't found in my title or in glowing newspaper articles. My legacy lies in the fair and just rulings I have made, in the lives I have hopefully touched for the better, and in the hard-won lessons I have learned from my own scars. My journey has been anything but easy. There have been countless nights when I have lain awake, wondering if I could have done things differently, if there was some way I could have saved Colton from his own worst impulses or made my father understand that a commitment to justice isn't a form of betrayal. But I have learned that you cannot change other people. You can only live your own life as truthfully and honorably as you can. I do not regret my verdict in Colton's case, even though it cost me what was left of my family. I still believe that justice, however harsh it may seem, is the only real path to confronting our mistakes and finding a genuine chance for redemption. I no longer actively seek reconciliation with my father or Colton. Not because I don't love them, but because I know that true reconciliation can never be forced. My father continues to live in his world, where reputation is everything. Colton, though still harboring a deep bitterness, is slowly beginning to find himself again in the final months of his sentence. I keep visiting him, carrying the quiet hope that one day he will finally understand. As for my mother, she has become a steady and welcome part of my life again. Our relationship isn't what it was before, it never can be. But it is enough. It is enough to make me feel that I am not entirely alone in the world. If I could leave you with one piece of advice, it would be this. Live your life according to what you believe is right, even if it means going against the expectations of others, even the ones you love. Justice, integrity, and being honest with yourself. These are the values that can never be traded away, no matter the price. They are all you truly have in the end. There will be times when you feel desperately lonely, misunderstood, or even rejected by the people you love most, but you must always remember that your true worth isn't measured by the approval of others. It is measured by how you rise after each fall, and by how you hold fast to your principles no matter how high the cost. I look out my window at the afternoon sun illuminating the snow-capped peak of the mountain, and I smile. I don't have a perfect family. I don't have the immense wealth or power my father once wanted me to inherit. But I have a legacy of my own, a life dedicated to the pursuit of justice, a heart that is finally free of resentment, and a steadfast, unshakable belief that no matter how harsh or unforgiving the world may be, integrity will always light the way forward. And I truly hope that you too will find the strength to live a life of integrity and honor.